Hello, beautiful community. By the way, there's a slight Australian twang to community. It's one of the. It's not one of the words I say in the really Australian way. Water is one that's super Aussie for me. But welcome, and let's do a little bit of bejesus, seeing the scaring of the bejesus out of ourselves, but also a little bit of reassurance and sanification around what if Putin wins, whatever that even means. Cartoonishly, it's simple, right? It means that the last of the great European empires, long after it's great, but thinks it still can become great, is clinging on to a kind of vision while actually being in its death throes. And in the process is changing borders in Europe by force. And so that's the bottom line, that Putin winning is a situation whereby it comes out that semi-alliance between Russia and China can hold hostage and make conditional the sovereignty of European countries. That's not just bad in itself, that's bad with a cascade of unpredictable bad consequences too. What Ukraine has achieved is extraordinary. And it's already extraordinary that Ukraine's independence isn't in doubt for the foreseeable future. But a Putin victory roughly might be Putin holding on to the better Ukraine he's got. And we'll talk about what scenarios might occur in 2024 soon, before the year is out. And then getting an opportunity to test NATO later on in the 2020s. And here an immediate question arises, and it doesn't actually arise among the 2 or 3 or 4,000 of you who are most connected with this conversation, but it certainly arises a lot in people who are passing by. What the hell are you talking about? Vlad, what kind of provocation or conflict or challenge to NATO are you talking about? The guy is stuck in East Ukraine. How is he going to take on NATO? And of course, that's a legitimate question. Like every question is legitimate because you're trying to figure out what the hell is going on. But sometimes, yes, I know, sometimes that question can be a product of a kind of gamification of war. And it can become the sort of question one might ask rhetorically about, I don't know, Arsenal winning the Premier League. You know, how can they win the Premier League? They can't even sort the goalkeeping situation out properly. And maybe they can win the league without sorting their goalkeeping situation. Maybe they can't. But the difference here is that that's Arsenal. And they're playing one game. That's called football or soccer. There is a multiplicity of games being played on the international stage. And they are fluid. And they are ever-changing. And you can't understand what's going on unless you accept that. Therefore, how's he going to challenge NATO when he can't even take over more than a fraction of Ukraine? Sort of dissolves, because there is no conflict between Putin engaging in some provocation in 2029 in Estonia and him only being able to capture a low double-digit percentage point of Ukrainian territory. Putin's idea, and that's how we should measure his success, is not about conquering an X amount of territory of Ukraine, although he wanted regime change in Ukraine. It's a regime change war, and those who claim that it wasn't are misguided. And what he's after is regime security for himself at home through war, not even through a particular war, but through war. And he thinks that link is now one he's stuck with. And so that's a kind of a conservative aim. And there is a revolutionary aim to rearrange the international order. And that's based on at least two ideological pillars. One is that Russia is sort of magically endowed with a propensity to go from last to first rapidly. And that Russia's strength lies precisely in its capacity to do that, which in a certain sense means that Russia's strength lies in its weakness in Putin's view, actually. And the other pillar is that he has a kind of Fukuyamianism in reverse that he believes, we've talked about this many times, about us. He thinks that our democracies are not just in decline for the next couple of decades, but that there's something special about history that makes this decline inevitable and irrevocable. It's almost like democracy is a kind of a disease on a political organism that is self-healing and will inevitably cleanse itself from it. That's really how he sees Western democracy. And in practice, that means Putin thinking, well, to what extent can I challenge the West's commitment to different bits of Eastern Europe? Can I bring it about that they say, well, we're no longer that committed to that bit of Eastern Europe anymore? And if he pushes them further, we might say, well, we're not committed to that bit either. And he thinks that that push is completely impossible today, but that a time will come when it is possible. And what will make it possible for Putin is democratic decline at home for us. And here, to this extent, he is right, not about the point at least, but about the mechanism that the point is dependent on. That's to say, our democracies are sort of ships that sail. And if they ain't seaworthy, they ain't going to be able to accomplish anything on an international stage. The functionality of our societies on the international stage is predicated on the sustenance of democracy at home. No democracy, or democracy in dreadful crisis, means these ships can't go out there and try to resuscitate a broken international system, a world without a world order, into some minimal semblance of order, or a semblance of at least less disorder than it has now. Let me now make a couple of remarks, I think, before I let you go, about thinking correctly about our enemies, people who are out to get us, like Mr. Putin. Let's not exoticize his alienness. And I mean that in two senses. There's two senses in which bad don't necessarily have to mean alien. There's a kind of an ethical sense in which this stuff coming out of the Kremlin and Ukraine's taking the hit for is an alien, is because we're limitlessly imaginative and creative beings, and limitlessly beautiful too. I mean, okay, not as beautiful as the beautiful community, but we're all beautiful, all humans. And we're also limitlessly destructive. And I'm not talking about each and every single individual. That's a separate conversation. But I'm talking about us as a bunch. And we're not just reminded of this by the Second World War. We're also reminded of this by what happened in the 90s in Yugoslavia. And I just heard for the 779th time in my life a professor today saying that Europe has been at peace for 70 years until Putin's invasion, as though Yugoslavia isn't part of Europe. But in Yugoslavia, folks that belonged to very sophisticated society decided to kill their neighbors, and were doing so for reasons they could hardly properly articulate themselves. So this stuff ain't strange. It's not strange when a big minority of the Russian population support Putin's war, but can't even say anything coherent about why it's happening. But then there is also a political story here that's important, and that's that it's not abnormal for the kind of institutions we want to aspire toward to always be under challenge, and sometimes that challenge is big and the institutions are weak. That's what's happening now. In better moments, the challenge is big, the institutions are strong. In other moments, the institutions are weak, the challenge is weak. But the challenge is strong and the institutions are weak. And unfortunately, that's also to a good extent true about our democracy at home, but nothing is set in motion. The pattern for sure, in other words, the pattern for Western democracies is indeed decline for the next decades. That can't be changed. But we can control how much decline there will be. And there is nothing about history in itself that dictates that this is inevitable, contrary to Mr. Putin, who thinks it's in the negative, or Mr. Fukuyama, who thought and now still half thinks this in the positive. So this kind of extreme political challenge coming at stuff that we're trying to desperately hold together to make the world take over, that's also normal. But now reversing on ourselves a bit, let's say something about maybe the way Putin is alien before we stop torturing ourselves. Putin is alien in at least two ways. Number one, he don't have a coherent ideology of the kind the Soviet Union presented us with. And that ideology was partly real and partly ephemeral, and I will leave that point aside. But the point is, Putin has nothing of the kind available to him, which is to say, you can't expose him on his own terms of not caring about values. You could actually, to some degree, deflate the Soviet system by undermining it, by exposing its radical incapacity, its radical destructiveness vis-à-vis its own positive aspirations about freedom, liberation, rights, and so on, equality. You can't do that with Putin, because Putin says, well, rights, freedom, go and play with your ephemeral democratic values that are going to be gone by 2030. He thinks. There is then that second way in which Putin is a bit alien, and that's that he's entirely rational. He thinks about what he's doing. He reflects on it. He applies to his project practical steps with greater consistency than our leaders do, indeed. We are lucky because our leaders are still managed by institutions they find themselves in. Putin isn't. Putin is the only institution in town in his country with perceived legitimacy, illegitimate institution with perceived legitimacy. But Putin is not rational on anything like a realist model of international relations. And we'll have a special video at some point soonishly about this on the main channel. So it's not just that he doesn't have an ideology, he's not rational in anything like the way John Mearsheimer might want to say he is. And that's not just because he's motivated by domestic politics in his international politics decisions, something that various kinds of realism in international affairs can't admit. But it's also because he's motivated by various kinds of occultist and mystical ideas. We just gave one of many, jumping from the back row to the front row. And to that extent, right, because he's not sitting around and thinking in a way that could be at least to a degree of 70% dragged into some economics-derived model of international actors that relates the way they act to the way an idealized individual might act. You can't drag more than 20 or 30% of Putin's conduct into that kind of model, right? Which is to say that he sure is as rational as anybody else, but narrower conceptions of rationality that, for instance, exclude mystical motivations, miss him. And to that extent, if you like, these narrower definitions of rationality, narrower conceptions of rationality, it's my job to think about what rationality is, so I'm being outrageously simplistic and trivializing. But these narrow ideas of rationality, of the kind that Mearsheimer might operate with, more closely capture, despite their ideology, Brezhnev and Khrushchev than they do Putin. So in that regard, motivationally, Brezhnev, Khrushchev are closer to Biden and Scholz than Putin is, right? So there's that degree of alienness there too. Enough for today. Lots of love talk very soon.